This is Mary B. Roberts in Mr. Wood's office at Oklahoma Christian College. I'm interviewing today Mr. H.G. Bailey of Oklahoma City. He is 92 years old. He's active as a treasurer of the St. Paul's Episcopal Cathedral. He has a most interesting life to tell us about today. He has been honored recently by the Masonic Lodge here in the city since he was the senior past master of the group, and I believe he served in 1912. Is that right? As master of the lodge at that time. He has had many other interests. His family are well-known people here in the city, and I'm going to ask him at this time to give us his full name and, if you will, please to spell it. Also his father, his mother, and I believe he came from England. So tell us a little bit about your beginnings.
My name in full is Herbert George Bailey, Herbert George Bailey. I was born in London at number 10 Princess Street, London West. I moved from there to Bushey in Hertfordshire and started my education there in a Roman Catholic parochial school, along with my brother Leonard, Leonard. Neither one of us enjoyed the environments around the school, and finally our parents withdrew us from that school and sent us to a boys' school in the neighborhood. I belonged to a family of 5 children. My father's name was Henry George Bailey, and my mother's name was Emily Florence Bailey. Her maiden name was Emily Florence Poole, Poole. The house where my brother and myself were born was not far from Regent's Park, where the zoological gardens are located, and where we could hear the feeding of the animals at various times. In fact, it was there that both my brother and myself rode on Jumbo, the famous elephant that the Ringling Brothers purchased and brought to America, and was finally killed in a railway accident.
Yeah.
My father was an architect by profession, and with his association with this Mr. Coleman, who was the manager of Windsor Castle, he had various jobs of designing various rooms throughout the cathedral, throughout the castle. In fact, when Emperor William of Germany came for Queen Victoria's diamond anniversary celebrations, he furnished, or rather designed, the room in which the Emperor William slept. And as a matter of fact, I have at home a stretch of tapestry that went into the decoration of that room. Remember Kaiser Bill, as we used to call him in England, in the coronation procession that was Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. He rode down the street on a horse with his nose up in the air, and you'd think that if it had rained, he would have drowned. I got to catch. recall very well that my brother and I, we were on top of a railing around an area in front of one of those flat-fronted houses which London is so famous for. We stood there high above the crowd, and we were only about 50 feet from the street where the procession proceeded. And while we were standing there, just before the procession came along, a couple of women came up and asked us if they couldn't get up there and us get down. So we told them that we'd been there for a couple of hours standing on that rail, and we didn't feel disposed to make room for them. They felt very much disgusted and went off someplace else to view the procession. Another thing I noticed too, while we were standing there, some woman had a bright idea. She brought a folding chair along with her and also a good-sized mirror. She stuck that down in the middle of the street, sat down with her back to the procession and held up the glass, and she got a good view of the procession as it went by. Quite often we used to take long bicycle rides, my brother and I. Sometimes we'd ride almost to Windsor. We were living at Harrow on the Hill at the time, and that is, of course, the place where Winston Churchill was educated. Another time we rode our bicycles from London down to Portsmouth. That was pretty nearly an all-day ride. We got there very much fagged out, of course, but we got over it all right, but we went back home on the train. I was very much interested in sports, and my principal sports was football, soccer football, and cricket. If I do say it for myself, I was pretty good in both those games. I also was very fond of rowing, and we used to go down on the Grand Canal out of London and hire a skiff with sliding seats and outrigged oars, and we used to go for miles up and down the Grand Canal. It was quite a picturesque trip, passing barges on the way, shooting the bridges, because when you go through the bridge you can't use your oars. You've got to get enough motion started that you can float through the bridge and then go to rowing afterwards.
I'm going to switch you to Mr. Leonard Bailey, the nephew of Mr. H.G. Bailey. It seems that Mr. Leonard Bailey's father has done some special research on the family back in England, and there's a few notes there that I would like for him to give us. Would you mind giving us just a little bit on that, and then we'll go back to Mr. Bailey again?
All right, Ms. Roberts. I must say that I'm not qualified to speak with authority here, except for the fact that I do know that my father was very interested in research on his mother's side of the family, and at one time while in London visited the Actors Guild Hall, at which time he picked up several interesting notes on people on his mother's side of the family who had been professional actors, actresses, and musicians. It seems that the guilds in London do preserve a lot of the historical artifacts, such as old billboard posters, painted pictures of the various artists that appear in plays in London, Paris, and so forth. And it seems like that he discovered one relative on his mother's side who had played the lead role in a play called The Daughter of the Regiment. This play was popular during the latter part of the 1800s and ran for years, as they say in the American way for years on Broadway. In this case, it ran for years in the capitals of Europe. This is something that we're going to do some further research on at a later time, and then we'll try to fill you in some more.
Well, I believe you said something about one of the actresses who, although you have made the statement that the family was what was known as a middle-class family in England, she married a gentleman with a title?
Yes, the title was in the name of the Kirkpatrick family, and her title was Lady Dawn. I do recall this reference to Lady Dawn, and in fact we've got a prominent place for her up on the family tree on the maternal side, yes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Leonard. Now we're switching back now to our interviewee of the day, Mr. H.G. Bailey. Mr. Bailey, I believe we had just gotten you through some soccer games and yes, and a rowing expedition. What other amusements did you have at that time? The young people, how did they do?
Most of the young people that I associated with were members of clubs for soccer, football, and cricket. There weren't so many of us that rowed boats or rode horses. My brother and I were probably rare in that respect, although we enjoyed it very much. We used to row some down on the south coast of Devonshire, where we used to go for our vacation occasionally. Of course, rowing at sea is a lot different to rowing on still water, so to speak. You're liable to get your oar out of the water and you'll stand on your head before you know it.
I believe now that we're going to go to a very interesting facet with Mr. Bailey. He was a participant in the Boer War. Would you tell us a little bit about your enlistment and your service? And I understand that at one time you were even sent as a relief to Mr. Baden-Powell and his regiment. Would you please tell us about those now?
The Boer War started in 1899 and ended in 1902. I enlisted in December 1899 and was known as Trooper H.G. Bailey, 71st Company, Imperial Yeomanry Mounted Infantry. For 2 years I was engaged in the Boer War, and in January 1900 was shipped to Africa on the steamship Galika. Landed in Beira, Mozambique, and went inland to southern Rhodesia and went into training at Umtali, southern Rhodesia. I might add that this little town of Beira is in the Strait of Madagascar. The ship had some difficulty in getting into the harbor there because it had a sandbank, and we had to wait for high tide to come before we could get across the bank. But we finally got there all right, and it was hotter than the middle kettle of purgatory in that town. We marched on foot from Umtali to Marandellas. That's a small village located close to Salisbury, the capital of the state of southern Rhodesia. About 150-mile march this was, and by the time we finished it, we were really hardened troops. I remember as we approached Marandellas, other troops that were already there heard that we were coming, and they came out to meet us. And when we met them, they started to walk alongside of us, but we had so much walking to do that we were hardened and could walk a lot faster than the average person, and these other boys had to kind of trot along with us. And there was a creek that crossed the trail when we came to it, we just walked right through the water, whereas the other boys, they took the footbridge across. But we didn't break ranks at all. We just went right on through water and nowhere. It was there that we were mounted and equipped for service. Some of us had never ridden a horse before. I know it was the first experience I had, and I didn't feel very much at home on top of a horse at that time, although I wasn't long in learning how to stay on. We went from there to Victoria, that's still in southern Rhodesia, and also saw the ruins of Zimbabwe. I don't know whether you would know anything about this, but these ruins have been there since the Lord knows when. We asked the natives around there how they happened, because there was regular masonry in these ruins, and we couldn't figure out how it got there. Somebody from Europe had evidently gotten in there and built this building, which of course had collapsed under the effects of the weather. But the natives couldn't tell us anything much about it. Of course, they didn't care anything about it either. From Marandellas, we rode to Bulawayo, where we all entrained our horses and went on south to Mafeking. Old enough to remember the Boer War will know that Sir Baden-Powell was in command of the town of Mafeking, which was in siege by the Boers. Well, we were assigned to go to his relief, which we did, and the Boers pulled away from there before we got there. There's another anecdote which comes to mind in connection with Mafeking. It happened after I came home, and I was on the train from Portsmouth to Waterloo Station in London when I met a fellow on the train who was interested in in the fact that I had just arrived home from Africa. And after we got off the train at Waterloo Station, he said, "Let's go and have a drink." So I went with him to the saloon on the station there, and while I don't use liquor in any shape, form, or manner, I took a soft drink while he took some kind of a drink. I don't know just what it was now. Anyway, I was standing there with my back against the bar, and I saw my brother Leonard come running down the station platform, looking right and left. He was coming to meet me. And when he spotted me in this saloon, he thought I'd broken away from my temperance habits.
Ruined him in Africa.
That was an awful place for him to find a soldier, wasn't it?
From. It's a dreary-looking place, at least I thought so when I got there, because there were great big mounds of waste all over the place, and it was the mold or clay or whatever it is the diamonds come in that had been sifted away and the diamonds picked out. Well, anyway, we stayed there a day or two to rest, and then we were ordered out to relieve the town of Boshoff, Boshof. That's a little town about 60 miles east of Kimberley. The Boers had had that town in siege, and they had signaled the fact that their supplies of ammunition and food had practically exhausted, and we had to get there in a hurry. So off we went, and we got about 14 or 15 miles out of Kimberley when we outspanned, as we called it. That was, we went into camp to rest a while, rest the teams and the horses. And while we were there, the fellas kind of scattered around a little bit, and one of them evidently got too far away. Anyway, when the bunch organized again to go on to Boshoff, this one man was missing, and myself and another fellow was ordered to stay behind with his horse and equipment to bring him up. We finally got him, and we were saddling. His horse was already saddled, but we were just getting ready to ride off when a lot of shots flew by us. There was a bunch of kopjes. Now, kopjes is spelled Kopjes, and they are hills. They're not mountains, but they're pretty rocky hills. And there was a bunch of Boers on some of those kopjes right north of us, and they opened fire on us. Well, of course, we stuck the spurs in the horses' flanks, and we just galloped as fast as we could and got out of range. But fortunately, nobody was hit, but it wasn't the Boers' fault. They fired a lot of ammunition at us. Before I get too far along, I want to refer back to the Siege of Mafeking with Sir Robert S. Baden-Powell in command there. This fellow Baden-Powell is the originator of the Boy Scout movement. And when my regiment was ordered to Africa, they knew we were going to be in touch with Baden-Powell, so they issued to us his book on scouting. Now, I had that book on scouting, and I brought it home with me, and it was in good condition. And some years ago, at a Boy Scout meeting in the old auditorium, I presented that book to the Boy Scout movement. I don't know whether they... Right here in the city. I don't know whether they've got it yet. They probably have. But it's an original book, and I don't think that there's any more in print.
Could you give us the name of any of the Oklahoma City people that you remember who accepted it at that meeting so that we might find the copy?
The secretary of the YMCA at that time was Mr. White, and he was also the ringleader of the scout movement in Oklahoma City.
Yes, I know.
He would receive the book and place it on file if anybody would.
And he was followed by Mr. W.C. Hunter.
And he was followed by Mr. W.C. Hunter, I'm told.
And he had a secretary by the name of Mrs. Green.
He had a secretary by the name of what?
Mrs. Green.
Mrs. Green.
Yeah.
Better stop this thing. What was I going to say? To the siege of Mafeking. After that siege, and we were on the march to Boshoff, it rained all the way from where we went into camp 14 miles east of Kimberley. It rained all the way until we got practically to Boshoff. We were attacked several times on the way out, and in one of the attacks we were ordered to gallop up front, and I ran my horse into a barbed wire fence. It was in the dark. It was pitch dark at nearly midnight when this happened, and the horse got his forelegs into the wire, and it threw me. I cleared the wire all right, but I had quite a job getting the horse loose. Fortunately, I had some wire cutters on my saddle, and I cut the thing loose and got the horse away. But anyway, that galloping around on horseback on a wet saddle, my clothes were wet through to the skin. It took the hide off of the under part of my knees, and it wasn't very long until I had infection there. After we got through with Boshoff, which we relieved, we were ordered into another section of the country, and I was on a wagon. I couldn't ride a horse. My knees were in such condition that I couldn't stay on. So I was on a wagon, and the commanding officer of the column came riding by, and he stopped and he says, "What are you doing on that wagon?" I said, "I'm riding because I can't ride my horse." He says, "Why can't you ride your horse?" I said, "I've got infected knees." Well, he says, "You've got no business out here." He says, "Get off of that wagon and get back to Hoopcrow and get into DR and the hospital." He says, "That's where you belong." So I had to walk back to this little town of Hoopcrow, which was on the railway, and stay there until a train came by, and then I boarded the train and went into DR, where I was in hospital for 3 weeks before they let me loose. So I finally got away from there, went on down to Prince Albert, and joined my regiment there. What happened during my war experience, and I think it's probably enough to make it interesting. And it wasn't very long after these happenings that we were ordered home. So we got on the train, left our horses and our rifles at the station where we boarded the train, went on down to Cape Town and boarded the Allen liner Mongolian. It was in an old tub. On the way home, we had 3 breakdowns and 5 deaths. Of course, they were buried at sea, and the ship was propelled by 3 triple expansion engines, or boilers. First one boiler would go out, and they'd repair it, and we'd go a little distance, and the next one would go out, and that went, and so it went until all 3 were out, or had been out. They fixed all 3 of the boilers. Then to top it off, the forced draft fan that they used to get air down to the furnaces, the head blew off of that, and that settled it. We just simply couldn't get more speed out of that ship than 6 knots an hour. Result was that we pulled into Portsmouth with steam up as far as we could get it, and 3 jib sails up front to keep the ship in the steering in the right direction. Otherwise, it would go around in a circle. We stopped at Tenerife on the way home, and we were fortunate enough to be able to buy oranges and stuff of that kind, because the supplies on board the ship had been used up. In fact, we didn't have any water at all except what the salt water that had been converted. And it was awful stuff to drink. And the food on the ship at that time was stuff that had been there since the ship was laid down, I guess. Anyway, it stunk when it came out of the hold. We were pretty badly disgusted with the whole transaction. We figured that they gave us a royal send-off to get down to Africa, and when we had finished our turn, they were through with us. Why, they just sent us home on any old tub that they could get hold of. However, when we arrived at Portsmouth, the same fellow that was on the dock when we left 2 years before was there, and he played "See the Conquering Heroes Come" on his cornet. When we left, he played the tune of "The Girl I Left Behind Me." Portsmouth, and we marched out into the highway outside the dock, and there was the band of the 7th Hussars. That's a cavalry regiment in the British Army. They were waiting there to play us into barracks, and we went into well, wait a minute, I'm getting too fast here. We got on the train at Portsmouth and went to Aldershot. That's where we were to be discharged from the army. And when we got out of the train and into the street, the Hussars were there to play us into barracks. And the funny part of it all was we went back into the same set of barracks that we used when we were training in Aldershot before we left. They were called Balaclava.
Balaclava was quite famous.
That's a Russian. Balaclava was a famous battle in the war, in the Crimean War. In Aldershot to be discharged for about a week, and then we were sent home. And that was when I ran into my brother on Waterloo Station, and he saw me in the saloon drinking. Well, we've finally crossed London in the cab and got on the Metropolitan Railway there to take us to Harrow, where my people had moved while I was away. My mother, sister, and youngest brother was on the platform awaiting me, and my sister, she was about 3 or 4 years old at the time. And the minute I got off the train, she came bounding down the platform and sprang into my arms. And I happened to take a look at the train, and the people in the train were all hanging their heads out of the window watching the family reunion. We finally walked home up Harrow Hill. That was a heck of a hill. It's dangerous for cyclists, I can tell you. They got a sign at the top of it saying dangerous to cyclists, which means that you better walk down it instead of try to ride it. Well, I think about a week or 10 days, I rejoined my regiment, which was being established as a volunteer regiment, similar to the National Guard in this country. And in August of that year, I went down to Windsor Park, where the regiment was in camp there for the annual training session. This all happened at the time that King Edward VII was being crowned, and we had to furnish the squad to march in the procession, the coronation procession.
Was that where you carried the flag?
No, I didn't carry any flag.
You were in the honor guard that marched in.
Yeah, I was in the honor guard that marched in the procession.
And, when you passed the reviewing stand, I believe that's when that famous band, was that the Grenadier Guards band that struck up that stirring?
This brings to my mind an incident which happened a long time before this war business, before I went out to Africa. I was then in an artillery regiment called the 1st City of London Volunteer Artillery. The King Edward VII, who was then Prince of Wales, reviewed 10,000 volunteers in London, and the big parade took place on the Horse Guards Parade back of Buckingham Palace. So we came down toward the parade ground, each regiment. There was about 6 or 8 regiments in the ceremony, and then we marched across the Horse Guards Parade to the combined music of the Grenadiers and Coldstream Guards bands. This music inspired me to a great extent. In fact, I was outside right man, being the tallest man in the squad, and when the band picked us up, we started to march across the saluting point. I must have lengthened my stride, because when I found myself about 10 or 15 feet ahead of the column, and the sergeant who was marching beside me when I started was hollering at me to come back. But those bands had me going south all right. I just simply couldn't resist it. I just lengthened my stride and off I went.
Very
That was one of the funny incidents that happened during my lifetime.
Well,
Let's see, what else we got to say? Well, it's about time I wound up my experiences in England. I finally made up my mind that I couldn't live in London anymore. It seemed like every time I turned around I ran into somebody, and I didn't like that. I'd gotten accustomed to the wide open places, and that's all that could hold me now. So I finally resigned from the audit office of the London North Western Railway Company, where I had been employed at the time I went out to Africa. And I went to Liverpool, got on board a White Star liner, and in about 7 days I landed at Boston, Massachusetts. I went from there to Chicago, and then from Chicago I took the Santa Fe down to Oklahoma City, landing here at Oklahoma City on September the 29th, 1902, which was my 21st birthday. I was very much disappointed.
How did you happen to know about Oklahoma? That's pretty far from London.
That's a good question. I had an aunt, Mrs. McGregor. Some of the old timers in this city probably know her. She was the mother of the city, so to speak. There wasn't a baby born in her time here, but what, she didn't have a hand in it. Anyway, she'd been living here. In fact, she came here at the time of the run. When was it? 1880? No, it was before that.
89 was the first round, and then 93 was the second.
It was the first one, 1889. She was an old settler here, and everybody knew her. Well, she lived at number 19 East 2nd Street here in Oklahoma City. I came in on the Santa Fe and got here about after midnight on the 29th of September. It was pitch dark, and there was a lot of racket going on outside the depot. I took a look out there, and there was a string of saloons then from Grand Avenue to California. And some were having arguments, some were fighting. There was shots going off here and there. It was a regular wild proposition, so I thought to myself, well, I've seen enough shooting to satisfy me for the rest of my life, so I'll just stay in the depot until daybreak. And that's just what I did. I went back and sat down in one of the chairs, benches there, and went to sleep. And the train came in about 5 o'clock in the morning or thereabouts from the south, woke me up. So I thought it was about time I found out where I was going, so I asked one of the station employees how I should get to number 19 East 2nd Street, and he just pointed Up, he says, just a couple of blocks up the street, up the track here, he says, and turn to your right. He says, it's on the north side of the street, about the third house in. And sure enough, I found the house, and I knocked at the door, and a rather stout lady came to the door, and she looked at me, and then she grabbed me around the neck and kissed me. She was my Aunt Rose McGregor. She was a mighty fine lady. I sure hated it when she passed away. But she was my mother's sister.
Can you tell us something about what the town of Oklahoma City looked like then? How much was there to Oklahoma City in 1902? That's before statehood.
There wasn't too much to Oklahoma City in those days. There wasn't a square inch of paving anywhere. Main Street had the sidewalk on it, on both sides, but it was a wooden sidewalk, and each store had its own sidewalk level. So if you went downtown at night time, you had to watch your step or you'd sure take a tumble, because they had nothing but a 16 candle power electric light on each corner, and that's all the light there was. But I imagine there was about 20,000 people here at that time, not any more than that.
No.
And I remember quite well one evening shortly after I arrived here, it had been raining. It rained hard too, something like we've had recently. They were starting to make improvements in the city at that time, and they had dug a trench down Robinson Street, across Main Street, down toward Grand Avenue. It was quite a deep ditch, but it was full of water that night. I went down to the post office, which was right across the street from that theater. In fact, it was next door to a theater too.
When was that? Was that the Overholser?
Oh, the Overholser was a regular theater.
That was later.
This was a movie picture house. The post office was on the right-hand side of
on the Empress, was it? The Empress Theater?
Yeah, I guess that's what it was. The Empress Theater. It was on the west side of Robinson Avenue, about the middle of the block. I'd been down there to see if there was any mail, and I was coming away from the post office when I saw a fella coming down Robinson Street with a horse and buggy. He got across Main Street and was approaching Grand Avenue when evidently he didn't know about the ditch being in the middle of the street. He couldn't see it. It was full of water, and the water was just sidewalk level, and the horse walked right into it. The whole thing turned over, and the man, he went clear out of sight. When he came up out of that, he was just red mud from head to foot. I stood there and laughed at him. I couldn't help it. It was the funniest thing I had seen in a long time. And he swore at me, of course. So I took off as soon as I could before I just started a fight. But I did feel sorry for the fellow because he really was pitiful.
We think sometimes that we have a few chug holes in our pavement now, but that story is really that is really a very vivid recollection, I'm sure, of the early day streets. Can you name some of the early businesses? Do you remember any of the signs or the businesses of that time?
I think so. There was W.J. Petty and Company. That was the hardware store. And W.T. Hale's Mule Barn was on Main Street between Broadway and the Santa Fe tracks. I remember seeing old man Hales get outside in the street when it was just a dirt road at that time, and he'd have his whip. He had a whip with a long lash on it, and he'd stand there in the middle of the street, and if he'd see a piece of paper laying there, he'd take a crack at it and see if he could hit it. And I tell you, he was quite expert at it too. He rarely missed.
I remember one of those old trips.
Then there was Brown COD, and what was the name of that clothing outfit?
Well, let's see, there was the old Rothschild B&M.
The B&M store, that was a clothing store, was on Main Street.
Was there a music store?
Yeah.
Was Jenkins
Armstrong and Company was the music store.
Yeah.
I know that because the Apollo Club used to meet there. I was a member of the Apollo Club at that time for several years.
That was a male chorus.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very wonderful. Great singers.
Tell us some more about that quartet, that group of singers.
The Apollo Club.
The Apollo Club.
Yes.
That was not a quartet. It was a real chorus. There was about 25 or 30 men in it. J.E. Crawford, who was in the lumber business at that time, was the director. And we used to put on concerts. In fact, we even put on a show at the Oberholzer Theater, which
was the theater.
Yeah, it was the only theater in those days.
About what time was this? About what year?
About 1904 and 5. However, the Apollo Club has been in existence until just a few years ago, when the television and the radio took over the entertainment of the public. And of course, it's gone into final worst. It's out of the picture anyway. Let's see now.
We were describing Oklahoma City. Were there any school buildings that you remember?
Yeah, there was a school building up on Walnut, which was afterwards turned into the administration offices of the school board. But that was the high school when I first came to this city. In fact, I lived at number 206 East 3rd Street for a year or two, and that school was right across the street from where I lived.
Do you remember the old water well, or did they have the city water now?
Well, they had city water at that time. Mm-hmm. I think that must have been installed before I got here.
Mm-hmm.
Then they later built, of course, the high school on 7th and Robinson, and turned this other school into the administration offices.
Mm-hmm. There was no library here then, was there?
No, the library came years later.
Mm-hmm. Carnegie.
Yeah. There wasn't a square inch of paving in the town when I arrived here. The cowboys used to come into town, and they usually congregated between Grand Avenue and California, where the saloons were. And when they get loaded sufficiently, they'd take a ride up Broadway and shoot their guns off as they rode. Well, they were a happy bunch. Fortunately, they didn't have any evil intentions. They were just having fun.
I wonder what was the first street paved in Oklahoma City?
The first street paved in Oklahoma City was Main Street, and finally they took on Robinson Street.
Now, was that before Rock Island? The Rock Island station was moved from the main?
Yeah, the Rock Island moved across Broadway at the time I arrived here until several years later.
Mm-hmm.
The Rock Island was right in the middle of town. The tracks ran right through the middle of the business district.
The Rock Island had the traffic stopped most of the time.
Yeah.
They'd get a long freight train going through there, and they'd switch back and forth before they'd let the traffic through.
When when did we get our first automobiles in the city? Do you remember?
1903. By the way, the first automobile in Oklahoma City was owned by H.O. Shelby. He's the man that I met in London just before I came to America. In fact, he and I were to have crossed together on the ship, but for some reason or other he got delayed, and he arrived on the dock just to see the ship pulling out. I saw him and waved to him as a goodbye. I didn't see him again till he arrived in Oklahoma City. I got there first.
He brought this car with him?
No, he bought it right here.
He bought it here.
He bought it. He bought it.
Must have been ordered. They didn't have dealers then, did they?
No, I think he bought it in Detroit.
And brought it down.
What kind of a car was it?
It was an Oldsmobile, and it had reverse seats. That is, it had two seats facing the direction in which it drove, and they had two facing the rear.
Well, what do you know?
It wasn't one of those steam,
No, it was electric.
real gasoline.
It was a gasoline motor, all right. Yeah, I
I
rode.
suppose there were many runaways from frightened horses.
Oh yes, the horses couldn't get used to that for quite a while. Finally, there were other cars came into the city, but it was quite a while before they became very numerous.
What did you do when tornadoes and storms came in those early days?
Well, we just had to take storms and tornadoes in our stride. There wasn't any place to go except into a hole in the ground. And since I didn't have a hole in the ground, I just faced it out, that's all.
Do you remember any bad storms or fires or calamities that came to the little city at that time?
No, I think that we were fairly well free of calamities of that kind. Of course, you must realize that there wasn't very much here. Most of the buildings had corrugated roofs and things of that kind.
There wasn't much value to be.
It wasn't until the packing industry got in here that we really had any kind of big buildings and industries.
Was that our first industry?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I remember I contributed $100 myself to bring those people here.
That's because most of our open range were brought there for
Yeah, because that was the big attraction, of course, is the fact that there was a lot of cattle in and around Oklahoma.
There was also an interesting wine cellar out here.
Yeah.
North of town.
I've heard about
George Churchman, I think, is proud owner. And you were telling me that you visited that old gentleman that owned that wine cellar one time.
Tell us about that and describe it for us if you can.
Yeah, somebody just mentioned a farm out northeast of the city where they used to raise a lot of grapes and convert those grapes into a very nice grade of grapevine wine. The fellow that owned the farm was named Fairchild. I don't know his initials, but he had a wine cellar which he dug himself in the ground, and he got native rock and built the sides up, so the thing was really a substantial cave, so to speak. I know one time I went out there with one or two of my friends. We were just walking around, taking a little exercise, and we landed there, and Mr. Fairchild invited us down into this wine cellar, and we tested his wine. I, of course, don't
use the stuff myself, but I did take enough of it to taste it, and I can vouch for the fact that it was really good. But I imagine that wine cellar is still in existence.
It has been reproduced completely.
Mr. Shirk
owns it.
I believe Mr. Shirk now has rehabilitated the thing. I understand that Mr. George Shirk has got possession of it now.
That's right.
I just wonder whether he's using it for the same purposes it was originally intended. In a historical sense, yes. Did you happen to go with the McNabb's daughter? Now, my father went out to court the McNabb's daughter one time, and it was kind of it was a little jolt to him, to go into this farm home out there, but he told you about the experience. Oh, yeah. But I wondered if you knew the McNabbs. Yeah, I knew the McNabbs. In fact, I think his daughter wanted very much to get well acquainted with me. I didn't fancy her too much because one Sunday I went out to see her, and she appeared with no stockings or shoes on. And I didn't. She was still a nice girl, though. And I guess she was still a nice girl, I suppose, but it wasn't the style of dress that I was accustomed to seeing ladies in.
I can imagine how a young Britisher would feel about our Oklahoma custom of going barefoot around the house when we please. I do it myself.
But you never can tell, in those days it was rough and ready, and they measured the person by his personality and what he was doing and what he was worth. I think it was all right. I think she was a pretty nice girl myself, but then it was too much of a shock for me to take, so I laid off of that direction after that.
Could you tell us something about the churches that were organized at that time? Do you remember about how many churches we had and where they were located?
I can do on some of them. I don't know whether the question of the churches of Oklahoma City at that time has come up. Of course, I'm an Episcopalian, and as soon as I landed here, I went to the Episcopal Church, which was then located at the spot where Mr. E.K. Gaylord has been hanging forth, on the corner of 4th and Broadway. And 2 or 3 years later, we moved up to 7th and Broadway, 7th and Robinson, across the street from the Oklahoma City High School. The Methodist Church down on Robinson Street was built shortly after the St. Paul's Cathedral. Then there was the Baptist Church, and the Presbyterian Church was up on 6th and Broadway. The Baptist, I think, was over on Harvey Street at that time. There were only about 5 or 6 churches here in the city, and I guess that was plenty. That was enough church to satisfy the 20,000 people that were located here. There was a congregational church in Southtown. That was the priest, I shouldn't say priest, I guess, the pastor was Mr. Harper. He was an Englishman, by the way. I don't know how he got to be a congregational churchman, but then he was. Another thing, too, about that, my wife was the organist at that particular church for 2 or 3 years. In fact, she was at the time we were married, and had to give it up, of course.
That brings up the question, where did you acquire this wife now? We want to know more about this.
My wife was born in Sabina, Alabama, and her father was a lumberman down in that country, but he finally came to Oklahoma because he thought there was a better chance for living here than in the lumber business. So, of course, he moved his family here, and in 1906, I had been away in Colorado on a vacation, and I had returned when I found that part of the family had moved in next door to us on 7th Street, East 7th Street. Well, then the time came for the rest of the family to come, that is, the mother and two daughters. No, mother and one daughter. That one daughter was the girl I later married. And I watched her get off the streetcar that ran up Harrison Avenue at that time. I watched her get off the streetcar and go into the house next door. And it wasn't long until I got acquainted with her. We used to have a lot of fun. There was...
Pardon me just a second. This is to be continued on the second side of the tape. Would you please change tape?
Oh, excuse me. I know what it means.
Yeah.
Thank you for catching.
Well, that's when I met my wife. That was in 1906 in July. And, of course, I wasn't long getting acquainted with her. And as time went on, why, we got better acquainted. Until finally, in 1914, why, we tied the thing up and were married at St. Paul's Cathedral on July the 8th, 1914. I was then living in St. Louis. I'd been transferred by the International Harvester Company, with whom I was employed, to St. Louis, and we lived there for 3 years, and then they transferred me to Topeka, and we finally landed back in Oklahoma City. But I quit the International Harvester Company while in Topeka and came back to this city and got employed by J.I. Case Company. And from them I retired in 1954.
Well, let's see.
Your wife is still living?
Oh, yes.
Then you've passed your 50 years then of your married life.
Yes, I've passed the 50 years. In fact, we're approaching the 60th year, or what would be termed as the diamond anniversary. So, and we're still hanging on. We have two sons. One of them is the oldest one, Herbert. He's named after me. Is the manager of the Chamber of Commerce in Baltimore, Maryland.
Oh, really?
And the younger one, Ronald Hugh, he's head of the sales department for the United States Chamber of Commerce in California. His headquarters in Sunnyvale, California. So we've been very fortunate in respect to our children that they have been successful in their business lives, and we are also glad that they have been successful in their married lives.
Where were they educated? Here in Oklahoma, or?
Both of these boys went to Oklahoma University at Norman. Herbert graduated from the college down there. Ron didn't exactly fit in there. He was only a 3-year student down there. But Herbert, he was educated for the ministry, and finally went to New York City and was for a year at General Theological Seminary. But they said he was too worldly to be a priest. It was altogether a misunderstanding on everybody's part, because he's not worldly. He's too good a fella to be that way. You see, he was a 6'6", weighed quite a bit, 210 pounds, I guess. He had served 2 years in the Navy out in the Pacific, and was quite a man. Well, when he got up to the seminary, he didn't have too much money to spend, so he took the job of superintendent of the church school at one of the Episcopal churches there. It happened that there was a family attending that particular school church, the father of the husband of which was an ex-Navy officer, Navy admiral. He had a rather good-looking daughter there, and since my son is not hard to look at, why, he attracted this girl, and the girl attracted him, of course, and he used to go out to the admiral's house and sit down there in the living room and chat. He couldn't take the girl anywhere because he didn't have enough money to do it with. But the admiral was quite a sport. Evidently he thought quite a lot of my son, and he'd come in and say, "Well, kids, what are you doing tonight?" They'd say, "Just sitting around talking." "Well, so-and-so's playing at the downtown at the Carnegie Hall. Here's a couple of tickets. Just take one of the cars and go on down there." So that's what they'd do. They'd go into Carnegie Hall and into two of the best seats in the house, and up
Did
in.
he marry that girl?
No.
No.
And in the guards up above would be the staff of the seminary sitting in the cheap seats. They'd see him come in with this girl all dressed up, and they immediately concluded that he was spending his money for foolishness. So they told him that he better go home to Oklahoma and go into business for about 2 years and let his mind fallow, and they would he could return to the seminary and they would pass him on through.
Well, we need some dedicated laity, just as much as we need the priests, I think. And your son probably has certainly fulfilled his real fulfillment in living in the laity, even though he didn't complete his seminary.
Yes, he's a good guy. He's a good churchman. He sings in the choir of the Church of the Redeemer in Baltimore. He has been junior warden of the church, and in every way he's a good guy. Then Ronald over in California, he sings in the choir there too, and he's quite an efficient chap. He's on the vestry of the Church of the, and he's quite an organist. He has an organ in his own home, for that matter. So he appreciates good music, and he likes the choir work because they sing good stuff, and they go around and entertain the other churches in the vicinity.
Well, I believe, to backtrack a little bit now, we got you up to retirement age, but you retired only to begin again, didn't you?
Oh, yes. If I had retired as a retired man, I would have been a buried man by this time.
What year was that you retired?
I retired in 1954, and I wouldn't have done that then, only I broke my leg at the time, and it was through that accident that they found out how old I was and made me retire.
Oh, you mean they didn't have the correct age?
When I joined the J.I. Case Company organization, I cut my age by 10 years, and they didn't question it a bit. But when it came to insurance policy with the company, I had to give them my correct age, and when they dug that out,
They finally caught up with you.
they caught up with me. That's how they came to request my retirement. However, I've kept on going. For about 2 years after the accident happened, I couldn't very well get around too well on account of my leg. It had to be babied somewhat. But finally, I got restive and I looked around for a job. And I got a smell of a job up at the Maywood Methodist Church. Well, I was singing in the choir at St. Paul's Cathedral at the time, and I was considered fairly valuable to them in that capacity. And when they found out I was going to the Maywood Methodist Church, they made an offer for me to be the treasurer for the cathedral. Of course, while the cathedral didn't pay as much money as the Methodists would have done, I accepted the cathedral offer just because it was the cathedral. Mm-hmm. And I was very happy with the whole thing. In fact, I am right today. Even today I was working down at the office and enjoying it. And I hope to be able to do that for a long time to come.
How long have you been with that cathedral?
I've been with the cathedral since 1902. That's when I first came to Oklahoma City.
And you've been treasurer how long?
I took the job in 1958. See, 58. 58. 1958 is when I took the job on. I've been there for 14 or 15 years.
That's remarkable.
And I've been successful in getting the church on a paying basis.
And you say that you're 92 and you'll be 93 in September.
Yeah.
That's remarkable.
Yeah, I'm in pretty good health. I can get around fairly well. And I'm not as nimble as I used to be when I was 39.
Well, maybe not.
You know, I got to read, you read a lot about people.
Who was the territorial governor when you first came?
Was it Lasky?
Charlie Haskell.
Yeah, Charlie Haskell was the first territorial governor, and he became the first governor of the state of Oklahoma
After it was admitted.
after it was admitted. I remember quite well the night when they changed the capital from Guthrie to Oklahoma City. I was downtown that night outside the Huckins Hotel, and there was a chap that had a big car. He was a plumber here in town. What was the name of that company?
Hanson, wasn't it? Hanson Brothers Plumbing? That was one of the big
I tell you who he was. He was the fellow that wrestled your dad, and your dad threw him in one of the...
He was a plumber. I don't know.
Oh, that's one I haven't heard about yet. You'll have to tell me more about that.
I can't think of the fellow's name, though. But anyway, he had this car, and a bunch of them got in it, and they went off to Guthrie. This was along about 11 o'clock at night when they started. Well, they went to the State House, and of course they got in there. I suppose the janitor of the State House in Guthrie was in cahoots, because they wouldn't have gotten in without burglarizing the place. Anyway,
That was a different kind
It's a different kind of a Watergate to what we have at the present time. Anyway, they got hold of the seal and as many of the records as they possibly could and put them in the car.
The seal was the main thing.
Yeah. And then they went out of town. They went out of the town honking their horn to beat the band, and people were in bed asleep, and they'd rush out of bed and stick their heads out of the window, wonder what in the dickens was going on. They were in the morning. They found out, of course, that they'd lost the Capitol. It was taken and put into the Huckins Hotel. I was down there when they arrived, and we had a big jollification. Everybody was happy.
Oklahoma was, anyway. Oklahoma City. Well, what did Guthrie, how did they retaliate?
Well, there wasn't anything they could do. They growled about it a lot. They wanted to have the thing changed back, but then there wasn't any. We'd already voted that the capital would be changed, so they couldn't go against that at all. But they would have done if they could, because that was a valuable thing for Guthrie.
Actually, we had to vote that twice, didn't we? Wasn't the first election was thrown out, and that was how it got at Guthrie in the first place. And then the second election, why they brought it back.
Right.
Yeah, that's correct.
That's Mr. E.K. Gaylord.
I didn't remember that for the moment. It passed out of my memory. Of course, this stuff has all happened years and years ago, and one's memory doesn't get any better as he grows older.
This yours is remarkable.
I can remember when Jack Walton had barbecued bear after winning.
Oh, yes, we want that.
I wasn't here at that time.
The story of Mr. Walton's big barbecue. Mr. Leonard, maybe you would tell us about that.
Well, I was a young lad at the time riding a bicycle, and I recall that there was quite a lot of publicity built up in this campaign of Jack Walton's for governor of the state. You know, he was at one time mayor of Oklahoma City, right? Wasn't Mr. Walton mayor of the city here? And of course his ambition then was to run for governor, and in calling attention to his campaign, his candidacy, he decided to put on a spectacular barbecue at what is now the Douglas High School area, but was at that time the state fairgrounds. And Mr. Walton had somehow secured or trapped or killed a bear that was also to be barbecued at this festive occasion. And this was quite an unusual thing, because people had heard so much about the different qualities of bear meat. Some bragged that it was finer than anything, finer than beef, and some thought that if they barbecued it, it might even be finer yet. But I do recall riding over there on my bicycle, but I didn't have the wherewithal to get in. I think it was, I couldn't contribute to the campaign.
Thank you, Mr. Leonard. Mr. Bailey, do you have something else now to tell us? I saw you looking over your notes.
I've about run out of material. My memory is not as good as it used to be.
Don't apologize.
But on the way from Chicago down to Oklahoma City in 1902, when we crossed the border from Kansas into Oklahoma, I could sense the difference in the country. Kansas was a state that had been in existence for some number of years, and it was quite beautiful. But when we crossed into Oklahoma, I ran into a lot of destitution. The trees looked like they'd been stripped of their foliage. by the storm. There was a red dust in the air blowing like mad. There was a carcass of a dead cow in one direction and the shambles of a hut in another. And the bear, there was no grass on it to be seen hardly. It was the worst looking scene I had never seen anything like that, not even in Africa. And I want to tell you, if I had the money to go back, I believe I would have turned around and gone back at that time. But I'm glad I stayed.
Good. We are too.
I've got a lot to thank Oklahoma for, and I really do. I'm strong for Oklahoma and always will be. And I suppose I'll always be in Oklahoma because I got a lot out at Memorial Park.
Right. Well, I think we've made a pretty good Okie out of him, don't you?
Indeed. I wish we had more like him.
Right. Well, thank you so much for this interview. It's been such a pleasure. We've enjoyed it so much, and I know that this tape is going to be something that will be played years from now about the young Englishman that came to Oklahoma. We thank you so much, and good luck to you.
Well, thank you. I wonder